welcome everybody to my Collections League Club. I decided to create this during the pandemic. I'm museum studies in my museum studies program at the University of Florida. My background is in information science. I just fall in love with collections because I did my internship in a museum of architecture in Colombia. I'm from Colombia, and I have been in US for a year and a half. So I decided to create this club because I think that it's very important to have a better understanding of my field, because in my classes I have realized that we have this beautiful literature, but once you are in the field, it's completely different. So how we can apply this and how we can have a better change when we are coming from like different fields in the natural history collections. So today we have a guest host, Chris Norris. Thank you so much. The idea is to talk. We will have like this conversation about your article about the future of natural history collections. So feel free to ask any questions, to ask something, to give your opinion. This is not a non-academic field, so cheers. And today I prepared.
Oh yeah, now you see, now I wish I'd gone and got something to drink now, because you've obviously you're obviously all set up and I'm not. I've got like cold tea still. So
yeah. So if you want, like, Chris, introduce yourself, and
all right,
you can introduce.
I will. So what I thought I'd do is I'd introduce myself and I'd tell you a little bit about me, and also a little bit about what I've been doing lately, because some of the people on this call have known me for a while, but they may not have known what I'm in the middle of doing now, and what I've spent the last couple of years doing, because I've changed my approach to things. And in fact, it's not exactly changed my outlook on collections that I set out in that chapter, but it's certainly changed my thinking on museums more broadly, and certainly on some of the challenges of museums. So anyway, as you said, I'm Chris Norris. I've been working in museums for about 30 years now, which is hard to believe. And I started out as a graduate student and working in mammal systematics, working with mammals in New Guinea primarily. I sort of drifted over into being a paleontologist and doing work on mammal paleontology. And over time doing that, I guess I became gradually less interested in the research outputs of what I was doing, and more interested in the objects that I was working on and how one cared for those objects, looked after them, made them accessible to people who were doing work like me. So I became interested in the business of running museums. I moved over to the States from the UK in the late 1990s. I started work at the American Museum of Natural History. I worked in the mammal collections there. I then got moved into the paleontology collections, partly because I knew a bit about paleontology, but more because by that point I was seen as a person that could solve problems in museums and museum collections and museum departments. And there was, and possibly still is, no more problematic department in the American Museum of Natural History than its paleontology department. It's very big and very complex, and it has an interesting and ever-evolving cast of characters that mean that it presents challenges for somebody that's interested in museum management. And after I'd done that for about 6 years, I came over to Yale and I worked in collection management at Yale, and then working in the VP collections. And that was when I wrote this chapter. So this chapter was written for a larger volume on the future of natural history museums. And I guess I got approached by Eric Dorfman, who was the editor of that, and at the time was the director of the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. And I got approached by him because I was, at the time, the president of the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections. And he figured, well, this is a person that can write stuff about natural history collections and what their future might be. So it's one person's perspective. It's a little bit of a challenge to try and write a chapter that is all about, you know, the future of natural history collections when you're just one person that works in natural history collections. But I gave it the college try, and I wrote it, and I wrote it around 4 main points, which we'll come to in a moment. But one of the points that particularly resonated with me was the question of access. And that's something that I'll talk about in a little bit, but how you make collections accessible, who gets to access collections, what they use them for, and particularly, mostly in my job now, who has the authority to speak for collections and tell you why an object or a set of objects is significant and tell stories around that. And the reason that's very important to me is because 2 years ago, I moved from collection management to the public side of the Peabody. So I'm now the director of public programs. I deal with exhibitions, but I also deal with K through 12 education, formal and informal science ed, youth programming, and also, what else do I do? It's a very big job. I think that might be it. I think I might have described the entirety of my job there quite effectively. It's a big job, and I sometimes forget what I do. But I basically deal with the public side of the museum. So I deal a lot now with questions about accessibility, about using collections, and those questions are particularly acute because the Peabody is in the middle of a huge renovation. So as of now, when I speak, the museum is closed to the public, the galleries are closed to the public, the collections are still open within the limitations of COVID for people to come and work on. But the museum galleries are closed. Actually, there's a lot of demolition going on. Those of you who are on Facebook and are friends with Tim White may see that he periodically posts spectacular pictures of huge holes in the ground and excavators moving and things. So we really are in the middle of a ground to roof and beyond roof renovation of the Peabody, which involves also a complete reimagining, we hope, of how we deal with our community that works with us. And so I've more and more I've come to think about collections not so much as the things that I cared for and looked after and made accessible to research users, and increasingly about collections as a public resource, as a resource that we hold in trust for a much greater number of people, and about the job that we do in terms of bringing those collections to those people. And not just interpreting them from our perspective, but also bringing in other voices and sometimes contrary opinions in terms of what we're displaying. So that's a kind of long way around saying that I am in my own process of evolution, even since this chapter was written. And maybe I'll pause there because that was a lot of talking, and see whether anybody has a question or comment. And they don't. All right. Okay.
I was going to ask Chris, you say
sure.
It changed your perspective. Can you give us a general idea of how your perspective I mean, I can see that's a very different way of looking at the collections, to move from inside to outside. But how did it shift those ideas?
Well, so one of the things, so let me give you an example, because I'm, in addition to running this thing, I'm also curating one of these galleries. So I'm curating the gallery that's the Cenozoic gallery. It deals with primarily mammals, but also birds, plants, invertebrates, everything else that comes from the last 66 million years or so. And so if you'd asked me to curate a gallery like that in the past, which in fact I did, because this is our second go at renovating these galleries. We had another go maybe 5 or 6 years ago that never really reached takeoff velocity. We didn't raise the money, and so we did all this planning. We wrote quite a lot of it, and then it went away. So I'm coming back to labels that I wrote 6 years ago about fossils, and I'm looking at them. And what I keep thinking to myself is, well, am I gonna? Those are the labels that I'm going to put out in terms of the public, in terms of explaining things to the public today, and I'm not sure they are. A typical example of where my my impressions may have changed is, I think I'm going to pull up a photograph, and I'm going to, if you can just bear with me, and I'll show you a photograph that's a very common photograph that's used around the Peabody Museum, and is my director, David Skelly, often uses this photograph in talks. Laura, can you get me to share? Can you let me share my screen? Can you do that?
Oh my gosh, I have never done. Okay.
You go down to share screen, and you should have an option. Oh, I can do it. There we go. I've got it.
Okay. Oh,
I've got it. All right. So this is a really well-known photograph. This is you can find it in Wikimedia, and you can use it. This is the 1871 Yale College collecting expedition. It's the first one that was sent west from Yale. Went up through Kansas and Nebraska. These are the guys that collected Hesperornis. This is Hesperornis is one of the ones that comes out of this expedition. So it's a big deal. And so you know, when Dave does this, he points out that that, you know, Marsh is in the back. If you can see my cursor, there's O.C. Marsh, who's the founding father of the Peabody Museum. And these guys are all the people on either side of him are guides, and then the four along the front are students. And so what Dave always does is he makes a joke about health and safety, and he says, you know, you'd imagine you show this to our risk management office at Yale these days, and you know, everybody's got a gun. This dude's got a really unfortunately positioned knife there. They're like carrying a colossal amount of ammunition. And he usually makes a comment about that. And in the old Peabody, what we probably would have done is put that photograph up and said that this was sort of a bit of daring do on the part of Yale. This is old style collection, gun toting, being an Indian country. You know, you gotta shoot your dinner and you gotta protect yourself. And you know, I look at this now and I see all sorts of different stories that I didn't see before. One thing that strikes you when you look at it is it's a really militaristic picture. It looks exactly like the sort of group photographs that you saw from maybe 10 years previously during the Civil War, when people were joining up and they were going off to fight, and what they'd usually do is festoon themselves. They'd go in uniform, they'd festoon themselves in there with firearms and other things to show that they were going off to fight and that they were going to win some martial glory for themselves. They are, as I said, armed to the teeth. They don't necessarily immediately look to you, if you didn't know it, Marsh's geological hammer aside, they don't look like a bunch of guys that are going off to do science. They look like a bunch of guys that are going off to fight someone. And so the context of this expedition in 1871 was that they were traveling into what's now, you know, the high plains. The place was a hotbed of, at that point, you know, Native American resistance to American expansion. So this is about the time that that Custer is opening up the Black Hills, which had previously been protected by treaty, and so he was providing military escorts to take people through Indian country. And Marsh, who was very well connected in DC, took advantage of those connections to secure an army escort for himself. And so these guys, when they went on that collecting trip, they traveled through the country collecting fossils as if they were traveling through hostile territory in time of war. They had, not only did they have guns themselves, but they also had a cavalry escort. They had Pawnee scouts. The Pawnee were the traditional enemy of the Sioux, and were often employed as scouts in that territory to go through. You know, the only reason that they were able to get out there and bring fossils back was because of the expansion of the railroad through that area, and the railroad was part of the infrastructure essentially for colonizing that region. So when you look at it, it's not so much a story of daring do. It's a story of how what we were doing in terms of collecting as an institution was tied up with, some really heavy duty military operations in that area that were targeted against the people that live there. So when we have to put a photograph like that up, what's the story that we tell about it? There is a story that's about, collecting was very different back then. There's a story about, Yale going into regions where people from the East hadn't gone before to find fossils that nobody knew were there. And that only got discovered because of things like railroad expansion, railroad workers wandering around shooting game and tripping over dinosaur fossils, which is what happened at Como Bluff, where a lot of our Jurassic fossils come from. But it's also, there are other people who would look at this picture and would react to it in a very different way to the way that we react from it. And those are also people that we serve through these galleries. So now I'm more inclined, and this is a super long answer to John's question, so I apologize for that now, but now I'm more inclined to look at all sorts of things that I might have taken one way or taken as being neutral historical images, if there is such a thing, and look at them now and say, well, what does that say about collecting back then? And maybe what does it say about collecting now? There you are, John. Was that an answer? That probably far more of an answer than you had hoped for.
That was a good answer, a very interesting answer.
So a lot of what we do now is it's not to dial back on the science in the galleries. There are lots, and we are predominantly a scientific museum. Our business is scientific research based around the collections. We have to instill, or we see it as important to instill a sense of wonder in terms of what we've had, and also a sense of the power and the potential that exists within the collections to answer all sorts of questions about the past of the planet, its present, and its future. But we also have to make an acknowledgement of some of the more problematic things that we've done in the past. That you might not think is something that you would have to deal with in a paleontology gallery. We've got many other galleries where we really have some very, very, very acute problems. There is a strong strain of thought within the Peabody, within the Yale community, for example, and beyond, that says that we have no business displaying ethnographic materials in a natural history museum.
Chris, can you unshare your screen?
Yeah, unshare my screen. Yes, sorry. Sure. There we go. So there are many people that that say we have no business displaying those materials at all, and that's a difficult one to deal with. And I could probably take up this and more, but let me get off, because I think, Paul, did you have a question, or were you?
Well, I'd like to introduce something because it seems like a good forum to do it. I just wrote a paper which I'm hoping to get published early this year, and I'm going to send it to certain people for comment, and I suspect you'll be one of them. I think that there is a thing called the art-nature divide within museums. I'm introducing this term, and it's got a copyright mark on it.
Yeah.
The art-nature divide is very simply defined. If you look at something in a museum and you extrapolate what it's saying, does it lead you towards nature or does it lead you towards humans?
Yeah.
So if you look at that picture that you just showed us, everything in there, if you expand on that, what kind of guns are those? Who were those people? Where did they go to school? It all leads towards humans.
Yeah.
So that has nothing to do. So that's on one side of the art-nature divide. If you then apply the notion that there is an art-nature divide, and by art I mean artificial as opposed to nature. So when you look at a diorama, which was what they were beginning, well, that was long before dioramas, but as you know, the big dioramas of the early 20th century, the idea was to try and get onto the other side of the art-nature divide, where you'd be looking at something that was presented in a museum, but the more you extrapolate what you're seeing, the further into nature you go, the less humans figure.
Yeah.
And this is a really useful rubric for this kind of analysis. So the Academy of Natural Sciences, sometime, I think in the 1940s, Alana might know this, just decided we're not going to do archaeology or anthropology. We're just not going to do it.
Yeah.
Because we're a natural sciences research institution. We're a natural sciences education institution. They very presciently identified the art-nature divide without calling it that. And we are often fairly grateful to those people because we don't have many of these problems. Now, we still do have the meta problems of how those animals in the dioramas were collected, for example. But looking at the dioramas doesn't take you there.
Yeah.
You have to ask those questions. Whereas if you're looking at a native artifact or the picture you just showed us, the questions are inherent in the object itself.
Yeah. That's a very interesting way of looking at it. I mean, I think it's interesting to hear that the Academy just made this decision that was the divide on which you were going to define yourself. Did you have large archaeology holdings at the time, or
we had Morton's skull collection, including the ones where he analyzed people's characters based on the shape and wrote the words on the skull. You know, criminal, defective. Yeah. They all went to the Penn Museum and are now having a happy time of explaining them to people.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think partly it might have been that we realized that there was the University of Penn Museum whose purview was anthropological, physical and cultural anthropology, and why did we need to be doing that as well?
Doesn't that run you a risk, though, of taking humans out of nature, and because they are part of nature? I was just reading an article last night here in Granta magazine by Callum Roberts, who's a marine conservationist, about which he calls shifting baselines. And he was pointing out the fact that when we look at the damage being done today to nature, we see it in terms of what we knew as children versus what we see as adults. And our baseline starts very recently. We're not looking at the environment before humans were messing with it. We're not looking at any of these other sectors. And he points out we have this real risk of looking at things from the baseline of only within our lifetime. And rather than taking a longer view of nature. So,
right, but here again, the art-nature divide is such a useful idea because nature keeps no records. You know, everything is recycled very, very quickly, unless it's accidentally fossilized, which gives you such a small and unrepresentative record. So given that the only reason that humans keep records, ask yourself, why do humans keep records of nature? Why do we stuff and preserve things? Why do we put things in collections and so on? It's to talk to ourselves about our relationship with nature. It's automatically to say we have a relationship with nature. And so already there's the art-nature divide built into even the fact that we will collect and preserve anything.
Yeah, I think where we've struggled with this a little bit is that, let me, I mean, the case has been made for our collection that the Yale University Art Gallery did a spectacular, beautiful exhibit on Native American ethnographic materials, most of which came from our collection. So this was a collection from the Peabody that was displayed and curated within the context of the art gallery. And it had indigenous students as curators, and it was brilliant. And there was, at the time, there was a lot of talk, and this talk continues to say, well, isn't this stuff better off in the art gallery? Wouldn't you be better off transferring those collections over? And where we stumble up against when we talk to the art gallery, and maybe this does come back again, Paul, to your art-nature divide, is that they say, well, we'll take the carvings, but we don't want the potsherds. The potsherds, that's science, and you guys analyze those things and do things. We don't want the potsherds, and we don't want the fragments of stuff and the arrowheads and everything else. All we want is the material for which we can see an aesthetic value,
Right. Yeah. And so a friend of mine is an enormous ethnographic collector, and he's very well networked in that world. And he said to me that he's working on a book, and I'm helping him with some words for it. And he said the other day, the thing is, we spent all that time in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands and all over collecting and talking to people and recording. They have no word for art.
Right.
It's not a concept.
Yeah.
And yet the moment, so this is Alpers's museum effect, that paper she wrote about the museum effect. When you take something out of its operational context and put it in a museum context, then you assemble a whole new aspect for it. You assemble a whole new vision, and it becomes art. Whereas to the people who made it, they don't even have the concept of art.
So our argument with this is that somehow is that you accelerate that process when you, I mean, we have limited capability to claim authority, I think, over describing a lot of these materials. But the issue is it gets worse when you move it to an art museum, because then you strip it of all context. Then you're solely looking at it through the Western aesthetic lens, if you like. And so, you know, as you say, you're taking it from a culture which never viewed this as an art object. It was viewed as something that had spiritual significance or functional significance. And you're taking all that away and you're saying, well, and it looks pretty, you know, and that's something that I think we have a problem with. And I'm surprised that more people that care about that material, of which there are a lot, don't see that as being a problem. So yeah, it's a tough one for us. So anyway, I don't know. Do people want to keep going in this direction? Because I think it's interesting to talk about this, or I can go back onto the book again and see whether we.
Well, you do have artists that are reinterpreting natural history collections in terms of art. You think of Rosamund Purcell's photographs, or my late friend Tracy Hicks and his recreation of jars of glow-in-the-dark silicon frogs that mimicked the look of a collection, and they saw the artists from that point of view see what we do as human beings, documenting nature. I don't remember exactly, Paul, how you phrased that. Recording nature, I think you said, as art in itself. And does art have to be in the mind of the artist making it, or can that be how we find it? You know, if you read much Neanderthal anthropology, you see a lot of anthropologists are looking for the first evidences of symbolic representation, and that's where they call it art, rather than merely hominids existing in the world. So.
Well, again, the usefulness of the art-nature divide is that it doesn't end run around that argument, because it uses art in its Latin sense, which is the deliberate work of humans. So everything that is the deliberate work of humans is on the art side of the art-nature divide. And if you extrapolate it, you just keep heading towards humans.
Although, this is getting twisted in my head now, but although you could argue that something like a taxidermy mount is a deliberate work of humans, right? I mean, that's something which it's representing a natural object, but it's still very, very much a human construct. As for that matter, most of our natural history collections, you know, as you say, things exist to decay.
Well, you can argue that any specimen is actually an artifact, which is something made or used by humans because we took it out of nature and put it in a museum. There is no nature in the museum in that sense.
No, but the art-nature divide requires extrapolation. So if you have a taxidermied mount in a museum, you're quite right. That was something that humans made specifically for a purpose. But if you try to extrapolate its meaning moves away from humans. In fact, it doesn't have a meaning ultimately. And there is the other expression of the art-nature divide, is that nature does not represent anything. It doesn't mean anything. Everything that we do represents or means something. So the divide is quite clear. This is what John Muir was talking about when, you know, he would walk up in the hills with the likes of Roosevelt and just say, there are no words here. Don't talk about this. Just come along and we'll walk through it.
For example, from your article, Chris, I like the way how you divided like into these 4 main challenges about the acquisition, preservation, access, and digitalization. What that was the last one? Yeah. For example, like from my experience as museum studies professional, and I'm interested in fluid collections, and I have been working in a fish collection in the Florida Museum, and it's like it has been an interesting experience, because like being immersed in a scientific collection when you don't know about fish, then I realized that I don't need to know, and something like very like complicated for me was like, okay, I'm learning the collections management theory, but once you go to the natural history field, it's completely different. In my opinion, I don't see many of this stuff. Also, like, for example, like talking about this challenge, I see super important the diversify the staff, because like I'm the museum studies professional and I'm working with ichthyologists professionals. And I have seen this relation, this interaction with the manager is awesome. It's all the things that we can create and we can change. And from my experience, and the things that I have learned is like, if we want to move forward, I feel, and as I told with John, that we need to pay attention to the museum studies literature and how we can move this instead of like, I don't know, asking for more budget when we have to deal with like this very like from the, I don't know, from the bottom challenge. For example, I like this question that you do about, is it ethical to continue collecting new material when we cannot properly care for the material we already have? And I asked this myself too, and I have been with collections just a year, and so it's like how we can change this instead of like, I don't know, going like in the same, yeah. It's like,
well, that's a good one to start with. Is you know, do people think it's ethical to keep collecting stuff when we can't actually pay for it, and then just assume that the problem is that people won't pay for what we're doing?
Well, the limit of that is the cemetery argument. If we keep burying people, in the end, there's going to be no room for agriculture. In fact, in the end, there's going to be no room even for living people.
Right.
So, yeah, there's inherent in the collecting enterprise is a limitation.
Yeah. Because I think it's a twofold thing, which is that there certainly was in the expansionist days of museums a desire to compete with each other to get bigger and better collections, and I think what concerned me when I was thinking about that chapter was the sense that, you know, an awful lot of what we do, it's not so much of a problem in the paleontology collection because the material is so rare that you know, it's very hard to actually remove things from the country of origin. But there is a sense that we're not building capacity in the parts of the world where you know, a lot of biodiversity resides. And when you look at the people that write papers about this, so you know, I'm a great aficionado of bioscience papers. There are all the International Journal of Hot Air, as I told the people that published it, and they were rather upset about that when I said that. But it's a great one for making these bold and sweeping statements about the future of museum collections. But what you find is they're all from like first world institutions, and they're all saying, well, what we want is more money for us to go into parts of the world that are not visited and sampled by biologists and sample that stuff and do research on it. There's never any talk about, well, what we need is to build the capacity in these countries, and this is how we should go about doing it. There's still an awful lot of me when you read this stuff, and that seems bothersome to me.
Chris, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
I know this is a couple steps aside. Did you go to the NASCA conference on decolonization?
No, I did read. I read the initial paper that kicked that off, and I think I've watched the first 2 or 3 talks from it. It's all available online if you
right.
Want to.
And I went, and I just wondered how that kind of discussion fits into what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, they highlighted a lot of things. So one of the things that I think is interesting is the sense in which, you know, when we record the history of collecting, we only choose to talk about certain people. And this is like, so there are a lot of people that are written out of history for one reason or another, and everybody knows examples like Rosalind Franklin, you know, who was kind of written out of the story of the discovery of the structure of DNA. You know, she was not a person whose role was highlighted in it earlier on. Now her role is recognized. There are a lot of bizarre things where you look and you say, well, I've got a bunch of records here that say this person collected this thing, and I know that's not true. I know that person moved through their collecting region with an army of people helping them. I know for my own purposes that when I was a student and I was collecting, frequently in the regions where I collected, I was not the person that was doing the collecting. They were being collected by local people. And I recorded that in my field notes. But, you know, unless I was diligent in following up with, you know, passing those collections on and seeing them processed, they'd probably be recorded as my work. And I think there's a whole strata of information within our collections that's lost, that basically, you know, removes the role and the agency and the activities of people who just weren't seen as being visible earlier on.
There's a wonderful book about that, about La Condamine's work following Humboldt in Central America, and how he wrote, when he got back to France as a member of the Académie Française, he felt he had the right to write out all his Navy workers. One of them made it to London and actually was then championed by a British naturalist who saw a good chance to get back at the French, and who contrived to get this guy's legitimacy restored. And the French attitude was he couldn't have done those things because he's an Indian.
Right. And then there was, does anyone remember parataxonomists? You remember the parataxonomist concept? That was big when I was
introduced in Costa Rica for their exploit the biodiversity project.
Yeah, Dan Jansen thing, right?
Right. Train locals as parataxonomists so they can just help us make the initial sort, and we'll go back and claim all the imprint glory.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
I was going to say, when I first started working in Latin America was, let's see, 71. I collected for years, and of course had help with local people, but I began to hear from colleagues there that why do you gringos always show up and do your collecting and leave? Why don't you ever at least stop by the university and at least give us a talk? And I began asking people that I worked for, because at the time I was a student, and no one was remotely interested. And finally, in 1998, I met someone in Latin America who had the money to make all this happen. I put together a week-long workshop on care of natural history collections. We tried everywhere for funding. We wound up funding it ourselves out of Latin America and ran those workshops for years. And there is still no one interested in doing that. And you know, the idea was to train capacity in Latin America to make the collections, manage the collections, and then publish the work. And the big change in all that was the internet. Prior to the internet, literature was so difficult to access. You didn't really see a lot of world-class papers coming out of Latin America. And at least in my field, in herpetology now, the dominant group are the Brazilians. And it's true all throughout Latin America, you have world-class herpetologists functioning at the same level because they now have access to the bibliographic materials. But collection care itself, there is still very little transfer of knowledge from those of us in North America and Europe who have hundreds of years of experience with managing collections to people that are trying to build them up. So that prejudice is still there.
The other thing that I touched on, which I also think is an issue, is the extent to which we write standards that only we in the developed world can keep. That we make statements about what are the appropriate conditions for natural history storage that you cannot reach in the majority of situations which exist outside of the Western world. And that bothered me the more I came about it. And the realization of that was, as I think I said, was the realization that our new collection, what it was then, new collection storage building at the Peabody was per square foot the most expensive building on campus to run. And in fact, what they've done now, led by Tim White, is fantastic work on figuring out how you can relax the standards so that the environment is maintained passively within the building, and it's not, you know, we had systems that were heating and cooling at the same time, which is ridiculous. You've got to, you know, and there are ways around that, but it's thinking, it's that sense of thinking, you know, when I write these standards, you know, are they really responsible in the sense that they can be met by the greatest number of people?
So one of the interesting things to think about here is the organization of the ology itself. So there's an enormous amount of duplication in natural history collections because everybody was performing the same extractive process from different parts of the world. So you will find Vietnamese material in French museums, in Dutch museums, in American museums, but you won't find it in Vietnam.
Yeah.
So if you restructured and you said, okay, these ologies only exist because of the way that the organizations that built them. What if you said, okay, it's not unreasonable to say that if we want to go and see collections of Vietnamese natural history, we should go to Vietnam. They should be there and not in Paris and Washington and so on. It's a very, very problematic practical proposition, but as a philosophical proposition, it's actually got a lot of legs because there are whole ologies, including ethnology, that if you ask yourself the question, if we made a world museum of ethnology, where would we put it? And the answer is there's no way you can put it.
No.
I think those kind of things are really interesting and highlight the potential for some real rational thinking about how we do this. I've often wondered from my own museum's experience why we don't have anything like an archives retention schedule for, I know we've got voucher material for some studies that really doesn't have any value past about 10 years because the studies are kind of superseded and, well, I maybe shouldn't say not any value, but I think it could be subsampled down to just keeping 1/10 of what's there, that sort of thing. And then if we put Paul's idea about geographic distribution, we don't want everything in one place, or we have the National Museum in Brazil kind of situation where we lose it all. But we can certainly think rationally about what would make a sensible degree of distribution of duplicated material. And then over time, what would be a sensible retention schedule for different kinds of materials?
It's hard, isn't it? Because the retention, the problem with talking about retention is that we're built around the concept, and I know because I've said it on enough tours and talks and everything else, we're built around the concept that if you just leave something for long enough, somebody will come up with a novel usage that you hadn't thought of, and that, you know, that's the power of the collections, is their ability to answer questions in the future that you didn't think of. And so, you know, when you say to somebody, what are you really going to use those vouchers from that study again? There's a great tendency to say, well, I might not, but then on the other hand, somebody might identify hantavirus or do something like that from those vouchers, and then they will have justified their retention. So it's hard baked into us, right? I think.
So as you've often seen, Chris, you know, when we're asked to justify these collections, say, well, there could be all sorts of cures for cancer in the Amazon. You know, there could be. Yeah. There's the art-nature divide. You're looking at something that came from nature, but you're going into humans. Yeah. You're carrying it towards humans, and at some point you'll have to drop it because it doesn't go all the way. The divide just becomes unsustainable. But here's another thing. So we signed some memorandum of understanding with the Philippines when we were working there, and the basic terms were: yes, you can collect here, you can take the specimens back to America, you must preserve them, and they remain ours. And as an economical argument, that really doesn't have much validity, because what they're saying is, we'll let you build buildings, employ staff, database these things, and keep them in air-conditioned circumstances for as long as you like. But if we ever want them back, you've got to give them back to us because they're ours. That's not a very sound economical proposition.
And yet, Paul, the federal government of the United States, because that's their model of operation, right? Is you come, you collect on our land, we give you a permit, you look after them, we make you jump through 1,000,001 hoops to count for inventory. We can take them back anytime we want, but we won't pay you a red cent to look after them.
But if you look at that as a repository agreement with a limited life, so that you know from the start those specimens are going back to the Philippines, it is sound economically, because the U.S. is in far better shape to build buildings and air condition them and house these collections than the Philippines. But 20 years, 30 years from now, when the Philippines has better infrastructure, why shouldn't they have them back?
Well, yes, but if the federal government makes that decision, then they can pay for it. And through the National Science Foundation, they may well do so, in which case you can say, okay, this is a form of overseas development aid, which is a perfectly good argument. But let's rationalize that. Let's formalize
the museum
that.
itself is getting the use out of them because the scientists at the museum are using the collections and publishing the papers.
Yeah, but they're not earning any money from that.
Well, you don't earn any money from your collection anyway, do you?
Right. So this is the point. The collections are a complete money pit. You know, you will never justify in economic terms the cost of maintaining a large natural history collection. Never.
Well, if you're trying to justify the existence of collections per se, you can make that argument unless you want to look back at the basic structure of science. But if you're just looking at who is housing the collection and who is using it when, then I don't think that argument is a very good one. Because it's what's wrong with you using the collections for 20 years and then the Philippines getting them back and using them. But if your argument is basically how much it costs to support science collections, you need to take a longer, deeper view of what benefit do we gain out of having science collections? And the answer there is that they are the building blocks of the basic research. We need to understand the environment.
Yeah, I'm not arguing for or against either. I'm just pointing out that one of the reasons that, one of the arguments that can be made against extensive overseas field work with these protocols in place is that we wind up being patsies. I'm not saying we do, but this is one of the arguments that people can make.
Well, I would make the argument that if you went into an agreement knowing that you were going to have the collections for a limited period of time, as a repository agreements are normally done, you wouldn't be a patsy, you'd just be doing your part of the deal. Everyone benefits. That quieted the group.
I know.
Well, there's so many biases that we have that affect our judgments on these matters, and one of them is just thinking that the collection as it exists 100 years from now will have tremendous value, or we should imbue it with a tremendous sense of value. And I think that's a real kind of false presumption. We should take care of our kind of near-term future, and then the next generation can take care of the following one. But there was a couple of other ones I wanted to mention in Chris's response, but I see you've got something to say, so I'll let you.
Who, me? I was only going to just say, I was going to throw you a considerable line of credit, Rob, which was that one of the things that's really shaped my approach to thinking about exhibitions is about the way in which you go about describing the different types of value that people ascribe to objects in collections. That's another thing that changed my thinking enormously when we've done risk assessment with you in the past, because I've done a few rounds of the block with Rob on risk assessment, and it really does change a lot about how we think about how we display things and how we interpret things. It's about thinking that there isn't one uniform set of values that we apply to objects in the museum and on display. We think there is, because they have a primary purpose in the collections that most of us are focused on, but there are a lot more values that attach to these things than just those values in the collections. So thank you, Rob, for doing that.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Then with that, maybe can we segue into, so what do we do in a museum management sense to respect all those diverse senses of value? Can you think of any stellar examples of what people have done for that?
Flackbait comes to mind. I don't know if you remember Flackbait, Rob, from when we were editing the book on museum collection storage. So Flackbait is a bomber that I think is in the Smithsonian. I think it's in Smithsonian Air and Space. And so they set out to restore this thing. And what they found was one of the complexities of restoring something like that, which is a human object, to talk about Paul's sort of art-nature divide, is that Flackbait was the home for a bunch of different people over the years that it was fighting in the Second World War. And those people did things to it. They played tic-tac-toe when they were bored with chalk on the side of the fuselage. they messed around with matchbooks and then stuffed them down the sides of the seats and other things. So what they realized was that the conservation of flatbait was a lot more complex than just cleaning this plane up and making it look shiny and new, because it was also a record of everybody that had ever done something in that plane. And that, I think, profoundly changed their approach to managing that as an object in the museum when it came to conserving it. They had to think about not just how you're not just returning this thing to an agreed state that it was at some point in the past. You're actually trying to conserve something that is that has been modified by groups of people going forward and not erase those portions of its history. So that idea that there are multiple values, it has a value beyond just its metal and rubber and steel as a thing, but also as a place that was people's homes, that went to war, that played a profound effect in the lives of the people that served around it. So, you know, we tend to think that we're preserving one thing in an ideal state, in a sort of Plato's cave state, and it's not. It's much more complicated than that.
Well, that's the classic dichotomy between conservation and restoration, particularly in the anthropological and art world, where do you want to make something look as pretty as it did when it was new, or do you want to preserve the history of it and all of the wear and signs of use that it's been subjected to throughout its history?
Yeah. It turns out with one ethnographic collection that we're working with at the moment that one of the most interesting things about it is repair, is the way people have repaired these bowls and these items that were in their possession. Because, you know, going back to the idea that we view a lot of these artifacts as artistic objects, but they're not. They're actually functional things that people use. And there's a lot that you can see in the way that they're repaired that tells you about the value and the usage and everything else. So preserving repair and actually highlighting repair is, I think, something that we'll do as we seek to interpret them.
I think for me, this brings back to some of the comments you made earlier, Chris, about how ethnographic collections are so much larger than just being viewed as art, and without the cultural interpretations, especially now as we're moving forward into involving Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge and reevaluating these collections. I've been in this world for a long time, in the museum world, and it has opened up such a new vision for me, and has reinvigorated me in my work. So for me, it's important to look beyond just the object and just the art.
The question I ask myself a lot now when I look at things, when I consider things that we're going to put on exhibit is, there's a story attached to this object, but is it my story to tell? And that I think is a really important question to ask yourself. I mean, you know, I may be comfortable writing about paleontology, but there are other aspects about this that are, they're not my area of expertise, but they're not even something where I'm sure that somebody who has the appropriate academic expertise in the museum should be talking about it. Maybe the person that made it should be talking about it. Or maybe, you know, or maybe somebody who attaches a particular type of value to it beyond the value that I attach is the person who gets to talk about that value. So bringing those voices into the process is an important part of what we're doing now.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And for me and for others in anthropology, it makes the story so much more interesting when it comes from their perspective.
We are getting close to the end of our meetup, but I would like to know your opinion. For example, I'm in my collections management class with Elise the past semester. I was doing my research in like what are the core documents in AAM for the accreditation for collections. So in collections, we have to have the collections management policy, but I realized that they don't ask for the writing procedures in each collection. So I would like to know, you all that have been working in the field for many years, what is your opinion about this? Because from my perspective, I guess that is super important if we want to move forward. I see that like the natural history collection, we have these oral tradition practices, and it's like, okay, you will be here managing the collection for 40 years, and you don't have your procedures, and you pass the next generation, the next manager. So how are we going to have a change in our field if we don't have like a memory, we don't have like a document? So I would like to know, what is your opinion about this? If someone wants to say something.
I think you bring up a really great point. Of course, we've got to document things to know where we've been coming from so that we can, make some projections on where we're going. From my own area of interest, which is this kind of risk analysis view of what we need to do to protect collections, I really feel strongly about that. Just from the basic scientific approach, if we cannot make falsifiable predictions, then we can't really learn, right? We have to come up with a risk assessment to say, this is what we expect will happen. And then 5, 10, 20 years later, you see, well, are things happening the way we anticipated they were, or was our understanding incorrect? So we just need this kind of documentation as well as projections into the future so that we can really learn.
Now, without documenting the preservation techniques and process we've used to obtain our specimens and then prepare them and store them, there is no way we can evaluate how they're deteriorating. And if anyone has ever, I have tried this with fluid preserved specimens, it is really rare that you can actually figure out how all of the things done to a specimen to get it into the collection and keep it in the field, all the documentation, the chemicals, how long it was dead before you begin using preservative, all of those issues are critical to really evaluating what we're, in Rob's sense, how things are behaving over time. And we need to do more of that.
I think there's a lot of lost contextualization as well. That's the other thing. So you might record a decision that was made. You might record the methodology that you used in a particular circumstance, but you don't always record why you did it. And sometimes the why you did it becomes really important, because the person looks at it and says, well, that's an entirely counterintuitive way of doing that. Why did he do it? I mean, I'm sure we've all had that point where you look at it, like, why did he do it that way, or why did she do it that way? And it might not be due to incompetence. It might be that they did it that way for a very, very specific reason, but you lack that context altogether. So contextualization for decisions is important as well.
I can go further than that. I can say, oh, why did I do that?
Why did I? Usually it's when I get calls from people at places that I worked years ago, and they're like, why did you do that? And I've got no idea. I have no idea at all.
Well, this goes back to that shifting baselines thing too. The understanding nature based on our collections. I've been in the field for a long time. If you count from my freshman year in a museum, this is my 51st year in museums. And I had the experience a few years ago of a colleague in Ecuador wanted a photo of a particular kind of frog, a little thing called a hambato, that used to be the most common toad in the Andes, and is now very, very, in fact, it was thought to be extinct for about 10 years and was recently rediscovered. And so I offered him a photo, and I had 5 or 6 of them clustered on a piece of cushion grass, and that I had taken back in the 70s. And he looked at it and he goes, well, this is a fake photo. They don't occur that there aren't that many of them. I said, no, I found these, I took the photo, I did not catch the frogs and put them all here. This is actually how dense the populations were in the past. But he was young enough that his baseline was different, and he had never seen the huge numbers that I had seen when I was his age. And he didn't use the photo because he would not believe I hadn't faked it. And, that's a shifting baselines thing. Did we ever document the occurrence of these things and that kind of density? And well, it turns out if you dig deep enough, there's a little bit of information, but that's a fault of our field notes, our contextual recording of what we collect, and then using those notes. The museums, they put out catalogs all the time. Almost all the big museums now, you can go electronically and look up and see what specimens they have. Good luck getting to the field notes. Yeah. Outside of American Museum, I don't know of any museum that's made a major effort to get field notes digitized. And even then, we're not linking them to the database. And my other pet peeve is databases. I have yet to see a good collection management database. Every collection management database I've ever seen is designed for people who want to extract information from the collection. None are designed by people who want to manage it. So you can't incorporate environmental records that you keep. You can't incorporate your IPM records, your preparation records, none of that, because it's designed to produce information, not to manage the collection. And until we start thinking in terms of managing collections long term, we'll never get to that point. But we need to rethink everything from field notes through our databases. Not that I would have an opinion.
You just picked up so many discussion points there. I was like, that's a dirty trick to do that in the last minute of the meeting, is to say, here are 15 things that people are going to disagree with me over. But now it's time to go. Bye.
I'm glad you brought that up, though, John, because in the anthropology division anyway, and outward at the museum, we are having a real discussion. Sometimes it gets a little heated about our use of rediscovery for anthropology collections, and the curators want a research database. We want a management database. As the registrar and my collections managers, right now it's too difficult to merge the two. So now I can say, well, John Simmons said.
Oh, great. Thanks, Elise.
Okay.
I was going to say, and it's being recorded, but I know we do need to stop now. Chris, I really enjoyed reading the article. It's the first time I've read it.
All right.
I thought it was really great.
It's a great article.
Yeah. Thank you. Like I said, it's one man's opinion on, the future of natural history.
Should be required reading for everybody in natural history museums.
You are too kind.
No, it's true. It should be.
Right. Well, I really enjoyed this. Thank you, Laura, for inviting me to come and see all these people, some of whom I haven't seen for quite a while. So that's really nice.
No, thank you, Chris. Thank you. I really like these conversations. We can bring our experiences or questions. And yeah, so thank you so much. I hope you all enjoy.
Thank you, Laura.
All right.
Thank you, Laura, for organizing. Thank you.
Bye
now. Thank you. Bye-bye.